So welcome to today's lecture on marsupial nutrition, diet and digestion. The objective of today's lecture is to understand that the marsupial mammals of Australia vary in their energetic requirements and consequently differ in diet and digestion mode. From information provided in this lecture, as well as from your own reading, you should gain an understanding of how nutritional requirements and adaptations to these requirements have led to taxonomic distinctions across the Australian marsupial group. You should be able to list key features of the diets of some Australian marsupial species, and you should acquire knowledge of the specialisations that marsupial species have adopted to adapt to different diets, with a particular focus on anatomical modifications of the digestive tract. So why is nutrition and thinking about diet and digestion important? Well, proper nutrition gives animals the fuel to grow, develop, reproduce, and fight off infection. So it will therefore influence population growth and sustainability, which is obviously critical when it comes to the conservation of species. Understanding nutritional requirements means that we might understand certain constraints on locomotion, activity patterns, demography, and population dynamics. There's also an essence of responsibility from us as the human race. So changes in the quality and quantity of dietary items available to wildlife have occurred due to humans and their activities. So we have a responsibility to assess those changes and see how it's impacting wildlife. Nutrition is obviously going to be important in the context of both in situ and ex situ conservation. So what do captive colonies need for nutrition to successfully breed to sustain in situ populations? Understanding variation in nutritional ecology can also generate insights into mechanisms that link ecological patterns and processes to animal phenotypes. So nutrition is important on many different levels, but I think it's especially important in relation to conservation. If we look at the breadth of conservation status of Australian marsupial species, we see that there's quite a distinction among those that are endangered, vulnerable, and those that have less of a concern in relation to their diet type. So just a couple of definitions of some terms that we will come across in this lecture. The nutritional niche is defined principally by what a species needs in terms of energy and specific nutrients, and is also associated with how those nutrients are harvested and extracted from available food resources. So today we're focusing very much on the how aspect of the nutritional niche that species occupy. You should be familiar with the terms carnivore, omnivore, and herbivore. Within the herbivores, however, there are a couple of sort of subcategories. So herbivores can be recognised to be browsers, which is an animal that specialises in eating leaves, fruits or soft shoots and shrubs, usually in more high-growing vegetation. Opposed to this are grazers. So this is a herbivore that feeds predominantly on plants such as grass and other low-lying vegetation. And then we also see folivores, which are those species that specialise in eating leaves. So food requirements are related to any energy expenditure and metabolic rate. It's important to know that body mass is a major determinant of energy use in endotherms, such as all mammals. In relation to marsupials, the traditional view has been that the metabolic rate of marsupials is approximately 30% below that of eutherian mammals. And this has been applied quite widely across a lot of research and a lot of studies. But it's now sort of recognised that this is an oversimplification. And at present, the balance of opinion is that there is an underlying difference, but factors such as food habits and activity are actually going to be strong enough to mask any phylogenetic differences between eutherian and metatherian mammals. For about half of the marsupials, metabolic rates that have been measured tend to fall between 65 to 74% of the value expected for eutherian mammals of equivalent body mass. So on the high end of the spectrum, where marsupial species kind of exceed the metabolic rate of equivalently sized eutherian mammals, the long-tailed planigale and the honey possum. And among the lowest are those arid-adapted species. So the bilby and the hairy-nosed wombat both fall well below what a eutherian mammal of equivalent size would have in terms of metabolic rate. So one consequence of a low metabolic rate is generally a low body temperature. And other consequences in relation to environmental tolerance and reproductive rate is the extent to which individuals are actually able to increase their metabolic rate above basal to accommodate things such as high rates of heat loss in cold environments or high reproductive potential. A low metabolic rate also has consequences for marsupials in terms of nutrient requirements and thus the width of their nutritional niche. So a lower metabolic rate means lower food requirements for maintenance and energy reserves that last longer under adverse conditions. If most marsupials have lower metabolic rates than eutherians, then it might be expected that water turnover rates are also low, and indeed data do support this concept. However, it has been shown that habitat has a far greater effect than does phylogeny. So in both mammal groups, eutherians and metatherians, these species can be easily divided based on habitat. So arid adapted species fall out quite distinctly in both those groups with in relation to low water turnover rates. Energy costs associated with protein synthesis account for a significant fraction of an individual's metabolic rate. So with this in mind, we should see a correlation between metabolic rate and whole body protein turnover rate. And indeed, this is what we tend to see. So we see that protein turnover rate in 3 wallaby species are a lot lower than those reported in eutherian species of similar size. And among these 3 wallaby species, tamars actually have lower protein turnover rates corresponding to the lowest metabolic rate and lower maintenance energy requirement compared to the other 2 species. So only growth and reproduction impose significant increments on total protein requirement, although our understanding of this isn't really specifically from investigations in marsupials, but more mammals generally, as there's a bit of a limitation in what we understand on this in marsupials. So differences in protein turnover rates are manifested in differences in the inevitable loss of nitrogen, mainly in feces and urine. And just as with metabolic rate, diet and habitat play a role in shaping nitrogen requirements. So among the macropodids, the highest requirements are associated with moist forest habitats and the lowest within the arid zone. The common brush-tailed possums it's been shown that common brush-tailed possums maintain on a strictly eucalyptus leaf diet required twice as much nitrogen as individuals on a diet lacking these plant secondary metabolites. So what this study showed is that there's a large loss of non-dietary fecal nitrogen on marsupial species feeding on a eucalyptus diet. So when we look at mammalian diets generally, we see that across orders, there are species that have different diets, but the diversity within orders is different. So if we have a look at the monotremes, the echidnas and platypuses, they all eat animal material, whereas the lagomorphs, so the rabbits, hares, and pikas, they survive solely on a plant diet, so strictly herbivores. The marsupials lie in the middle, so they have representatives from all different diet categories, and have representatives of carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores. So they're quite an interesting group to explore in relation to diet and digestion and adaptations to those differences in diets. Australian marsupials can be categorised by differences in dentition. So obviously differences in dentition are going to relate to differences in diet. We have the Diprotodontia, which are almost all herbivores. So Diprotodontia means two front teeth, and all members of this order have a single pair of large incisors in the upper and lower jaw, which is quite evident here. They also have grinding incisors to make it easy to munch on plants and grasses, and they lack canines. In contrast, the Polyprotodontia, which describes mostly the carnivores and omnivores, they tend to have multiple front teeth. So they'll have 4 to 5 pairs of upper incisors and 2 to 3 pairs of lower incisors. And some do have well-developed canines, which is obviously ideal for the carnivorous species. But some of these the omnivore species also have canines, such as bandicoots and bilbies. So Australian marsupials can be broadly categorised based on what they eat. The dasyurids tend to describe the carnivorous marsupials, and this includes quolls, the Tassie devils, numbats, dunnarts, and antechinus. The paramelomorphs, the bilbies and bandicoots, and they're our omnivores. And the diprotodonts, which are the herbivorous marsupials, include kangaroos, wallabies, possums, koalas, and wombats. So we're just going to have a look across the marsupials at these species that have these different diet types, and predominantly focus on gut morphology and differences in gut based on diets. So we're going to start with the herbivores. So among marsupials, the gastrointestinal tract of herbivores is longer than carnivores and omnivores, but they have a shorter small intestine. The tract is divided into a hindgut and a foregut. The herbivores are divided into hindgut and foregut fermenters. So the hindgut fermenters include all the non-macropodid herbivores, whereas the foregut fermenters includes the macropodid herbivores. So wombats, which are the vegetarians of the underworld, they are the largest Australian burrowing species and include the common or bare-nosed wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat. All wombats are adapted to survive in habitats with low food availability and limited nutrition, and they have low metabolic rates and are energy efficient, and have an energy efficient foraging strategy to lead to very low energy requirements. They are able to survive on low quality food and actually inhabit areas of scarce food availability. So habitat loss and fragmentation is limiting access to suitable areas for foraging. So not surprisingly, they have, 2 of the 3 species have a conservation status, with the northern hairy-nosed wombat being critically endangered. So diet selection in wombats is dictated by quality and availability of food resources, as well as nutritional requirements and digestive constraints. Wombats are strict hindgut fermenters with a diet that is predominantly consists of native grasses. Preferred grass species will vary with season, weather conditions, and availability. So the common wombat has the broadest diet. It's dominated by grass, and the remainder of the diet can vary considerably and include oat, crops, sedges, as well as invasive plant species, and sometimes fungi during low food availability. The northern hairy-nosed wombat will feed on a small range of grasses. Changes in the diet of this species have actually been observed over the last 30 years due to droughts occurring in central Queensland. So this is a unfortunate detrimental impact of climate change. The southern hairy-nosed wombat has the most restricted diet, and it feeds almost exclusively on Balcara grass, which is pictured here. So the gut morphology of the wombat, basically it has a long and spacious intestine to compensate for this relatively low nutrient diet. So digestion times can take between 40 and 80 hours. It has a very small cecum present. So the cecum is a pouch at the first part of the intestine. So wombats have a very small cecum, and the hindgut is dominated by an enlarged colon. The proximal colon, or the first section of the colon, is the primary site for microbial fermentation, whereas the distal colon is for water retention. Horstrations extend over the entire length of the colon. So it's quite horstrated. And then the stomach is a fairly simple and single-chambered organ. So a combination of a large capacity colon and a slow rate of passage is what maximises the opportunity for plant cellulose digestion in the wombat. So you may have heard a bit of attention surrounding the shape of wombat poos, and I was a bit curious to find out how a cube-shaped poo could come from a round bottom. There was a paper released in 2021 where it showed that this was due to the shape and flexibility of the intestines, as well as the fact that the wombats inhabit a relatively dry environment. So feces actually start out in a liquid type state and then change to a solid state in the final 25% of their passage through the intestines. And what these researchers discovered is that the intestine exhibits regions with a 2-fold increase in thickness and a 4-fold increase in stiffness. So that kind of pressure pushing down on the feces facilitates the formation of corners by contractions of the intestine. And then you end up with cube-shaped poo. The hind region of the colon is the site of the water resorption during digestion. So the desert-adapted southern hairy-nosed wombat has a large distal colon and a small proximal colon, whereas the forest-dwelling common wombat has the opposite, so a small distal colon and a large proximal colon. Water turnover rate in wombats is among the lowest for all herbivorous mammals, although the urine is actually not that concentrated, so this low water turnover rate is achieved by efficiency of the distal colon. The southern hairy-nosed wombat, so the faeces content can be actually less than 40% in the summer months, And so during this time, they are actually deriving all water requirements from their diet, and they're not drinking any free water. So moving on now to leaf-eating marsupials. These species will inhabit the forests and woodlands of Australia and consume eucalyptus leaves as well as the leaves of other tree species. The marsupial leaf eaters are recognised to be cecum fermenters and are members of 3 families of arboreal herbivores. So the leaf-eating marsupials have a restricted range in body mass of between 700 grams and 15 kilos. The lower limit of 700 grams is set by the nature of the leaf diet, while the upper limit is set by the energetic cost of climbing and the fact that they need to be supported by tree branches, so they can't get too large. Eucalyptus leaves are actually characterised by high levels of indigestible fibre and low levels of essential nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium and nitrogen. Levels of protein and non-cellulose carbohydrates are also low, so not the most desirable diet items to be eating, especially when we contrast this to grasses, which actually contain higher levels of carbohydrates and can be used, which can be used after hydrolyzation in the gut. So eucalyptus foliage also contain these secondary defence chemicals that need to be detoxified. And by defence chemicals, we're referring to things such as tannins and cyanogens. So how is it that these animals can live and survive on a eucalyptus diet, especially when they contain these toxic components? It's really strange. So what we recognise is that the chemical constituents of eucalyptus foliage is contains a very high proportion of inedible material and secondary chemicals, which is evident here. So you have the constituents of a eucalyptus leaf with approximately just a little over half actually being useful for food. And then we see that the energy budget of an example eucalyptus leaf eater, which is the greater glider, it actually uses about 50% of the energy budget to detoxify those secondary chemicals. So that's quite amazing. It's quite a specialised diet. And what is interesting as well is I think that out of this whole energy budget that they have to spend, such a little amount is spent on actually moving and reproducing in relation to the energy spent on detoxifying secondary compounds. So the koala is a eucalypt specialist. It's the closest relative of the wombat, and they evolved from ground-living ancestors that eventually became arboreal. In February of 2022, the status of the koala was changed from vulnerable to endangered, predominantly due to those horrific fires that we witnessed at the start of 2020. They're able to consume large quantities of eucalyptus leaf, but they're selective in the species they eat, and they will vary their choice at different times of the year. So they tend to go for new foliage that is high in crude protein and low in fibre and lignin. It is the largest marsupial folivore, weighing up to 14 kilos. So it has an advantage in living on eucalyptus foliage compared to the smaller species. Because they're large, this means that their metabolic requirements are relatively low and their gut is relatively large. So they have low energy requirements with a large capacity to eat a lot of the eucalyptus leaves. They possess a battery of high-crowned ridge molar teeth that cut the leaf into smaller pieces, but they're actually not grinding any further, which is quite interesting. So just essentially shredding the leaves into smaller pieces with no grinding. So the koalas, with their gut morphology, or with their diet rather, they have a number of challenges. They need to break down the leaf cell wall to obtain the cell cytoplasm that contains protein and carbohydrate. They need to find a way to dispose of indigestible fibre, and then they need to detoxify these plant defence chemicals. One way to get this all done is to have a bacteria fermenter that will ferment this material in a special part of the gut. So koalas have this. They have a hindgut that is dominated by an extremely well-developed cecum. So that is evident here. This structure here is the cecum. The epithelial surface of this structure, as well as the proximal colon, is actually populated with large numbers of bacteria that are capable of degrading these tannin protein complexes in their diet. So some folivores actually re-ingest waste material. So what we have here is a diagram of a leaf-eating marsupial gut that has a hindgut fermentation chamber, which can break down cellulose to short-chain fatty acids and recycle urea into bacterial protein. So what we get is the raw leaf going in, it's chomped up a little bit with the teeth, it goes through the stomach, the small intestines are then absorbing some carbohydrates, amino acids and lipids. But then you have this cecum fermenter where it will sit and the short chain fatty acids are absorbed. The colon, like in the wombat, is the place where water is pulled back out. And then what we see in some species is that they will actually, the waste that is produced is actually split into two types of waste or feces, some that are disposed of and then others that are actually re-ingested as cecal pellets. And then what happens is that protein is then accessible from these cecal pellets, and that's a way that these species are able to access that protein. So one such species is the ringtail possum. The ringtail possum is known to have daily fecal patterns with two types of poo. So during the night while foraging, they will void hard feces with low nitrogen content, and that is true waste. So they are those pellets are left. However, during the day while they are sleeping, so they're a nocturnal species, most cecal pellets with high nitrogen content are produced at this time and then re-ingested. And it's been found that the cecal pellets have 3 times the water content and more than 2 times the nitrogen content to day pellets. So the re-ingestion of cecal contents is highly important in the energy balance and water conservation for these species, especially during lactation. Moving along now to browsers and grazers, which are mostly our kangaroos. So macropods consume a wide variety of plant species, and this ranges from grasses to flowering plants, ferns and fungi. Even though they have access to a vast array of plants in their habitat, each species is actually quite selective. So the smallest ones are the most selective because they actually need substantial amounts of high quality food to satisfy a higher metabolic rate. And so the smaller species are recognised mainly to be browsers. They're going to feed on things like fruits, seeds, flowers. The larger species are least selective, so their greatest need is to actually harvest enough food to supply their daily needs. So these are your big kangaroos that are grazing on grasses quite continuously. So they do not regurgitate digestier for secondary mastication. Therefore, food must be masticated well to maximise the availability of plant cell contents for digestion. And dentition actually differs between browsers and grazers to facilitate these different diets and feeding types. So in kangaroos, the principal site for microbial fermentation is the extremely large stomach. This is horse-traded as a result of longitudinal bands of muscle. So this is this structure here, so 4 gut fermenters. Food is retained in the stomach for approximately 30% of the total transit time through the digestive tract. The stomach actually functions to separate the liquid and solid phase of the diet. So liquid passes through in about half the time that solids pass. The stomach consists of a non-glandular forestomach, which is the site of fermentation, and then there is a glandular hindstomach where true digestion commences. So this is what a kangaroo gut looks like in real life. You can see here is the gut here. So I think that this butt here looks like the forestomach, and maybe this is the hind stomach here, looking at the kind of side-on view in this small image. So the forestomach consists of a blind-ending compartment and a tubiform compartment that leads to the hind gut. This tubiform compartment ranges from about 50 to 80% of the total complex volume. So moving on to a more specialist, a marsupial species with a more specialist diet, and talking about the honey possum, which is a pollinivore. So this is one of the most unusual of marsupials, as it's adapted to a unique nectar and pollen diet. The honey possum is tiny in size, only weighing between 7 and 15 grams. And due to this unique diet, they have dietary specializations, which include a loss of teeth. They have a long bristled tip tongue. They have exceptionally low nitrogen requirements, and there is a high rate of passage. So the gut of the honey possum is also unusual. They lack a cecum and possess a bilobed stomach, which has a marked diverticulum to serve as storage. So there's actually no bacterial digestion that occurs in the stomach at all. Okay, so that's our herbivores, and moving on to omnivores now. As you're probably aware, omnivores include those marsupial species that eat plant and animal material. Generally, mammal omnivores have simple stomachs, but the intestine is longer than that of carnivores, with the mid-gut to hindgut ratio varying quite greatly between species. So, for example, bears have a very long midgut and a short and distinct hindgut, whereas the opossum's hindgut constitutes 50% of the length of the intestine. And there's also, we see that a cecum may or may not be present among omnivore mammals generally, but tends to be present in marsupial omnivores. So the brush-tailed possum, this species was once considered to only be a generalist folivore, but we actually now know that the brush-tailed possum obtains energy and nutrients from sources other than just leaves. They are among the smallest of the leaf-eating mammals, and therefore it's recognised that they would actually face problems in meeting their energy requirements from a leaf-only diet. So there's evidence that possums actually predate on birds, eggs, fledglings, invertebrates, and small reptiles. So yes, although once thought to be a generalist folivore, it's now recognised that these species eats a wide range of different food types, including animals. The possum has a cecum and a proximal colon, which represents a large proportion of the digestive tract. So here you have the cecum and the proximal colon. The enlarged cecum is simple in structure. It doesn't have any horstrations, but does possess colonic horstrations. So I guess that would be along here. So that's similar to what we saw in the wombats. There's no selective retention of solutes and fine particles in the cecum, which is what we saw in the ringtail possum, which is likely why brush-tail possums can not only survive on a leaf-only diet. The bilby is another omnivore, and in contrast, the bilby has quite a simple digestive anatomy. So the bilby will primarily consume insects during summer, but will switch to a more granivorous diet during winter. So a bit more seasonal in terms of their omnivore nature. The simple stomach without the sacculated structure associated. So they have a simple stomach and they don't have that complex structure that we see in the kangaroos. The cecum is relatively short and bulbous, so that's that indicated here. And there's no selective retention of solutes and fine particles in the cecum, which suggests that they need to consume relatively low fibre diets, such as insects and grains. Okay, moving on to carnivores. So protein in animal flesh is actually much easier to digest than cellulose, resulting in carnivores having a fairly short and simple digestive tract. And there's often it's characterised by a very muscular stomach. So most carnivorous mammals also have a relatively short hindgut, and this is actually indistinguishable from the midgut in many species. These traits are seen in carnivorous marsupials, and the Australian species actually lack a cecum. So here you have the stomach of the quoll, and followed by the intestines, with no real distinction. So the spotted tail quoll is an ambush predator and will eat a variety of prey, including gliders, possums, wallabies, as well as insects and reptiles. They will also scavenge on carrion, including human flesh, which we will get to in a minute. So gut microbiomes, there's also distinct differences in the populations of different microbes in the gut of carnivore and herbivorous marsupial species. So we tend to see a high vermiculate to bacterioidetes ratio in carnivorous species. So this is believed to be related to the need to efficiently harvest and store energy from limited food sources. So this aligns with what we know of carnivorous marsupials in terms of their feeding habit. So they'll tend to gorge up to, or Tasmanian devils specifically will tend to gorge up to 40% of their body weight in a single meal, which will then be followed by several days of no feeding, which is quite different if you think about kangaroos as herbivorous grazers that are constantly consuming food. The carnivores also have these sort of distinct characteristics to their skull and dentition associated with eating meat. So again, the Tasmanian devil, which is actually the largest carnivorous marsupial currently living. Its range was once throughout continental Australia, but it's now only found in the island state of Tasmania. So its status is endangered. They are pounce pursuit predators, but they're also foragers for prey, and they're facultative scavengers. So young devils will actually favour a diet of smaller mammals, as well as birds, reptiles and insects. But then as they age, they tend to shift primarily to eating macropods, such as wallabies and pademelons. So the skulls of Tassie devils have pronounced mid-sagittal crest, a broad and widely spaced zygomatic arches, and thick maxillofacial bones. So these features are to accommodate powerful masticatory musculature that generates exceptional strong bite force and makes them capable of crushing prey bones. They have a dentition with maxillary incisor teeth that are oriented transversely, so straight up basically like ours. So that's just in contrast to what we see in some of the grazers, where these teeth are actually have a more horizontal orientation. They have a rostral positioning of the very strong and enlarged canine teeth, and basically these two features, so the orientation of the incisors and the rostral positioning of the canine teeth are to facilitate the grasping of large prey. So here I just have a video of a quoll. This is a dead pademelon that it is scavenging on. So you can see there's a lot of chomping and tugging and pulling to try and free up that flesh. So spotted tail quolls have actually recently featured in a research paper associated with their habit of having a taste for human flesh. So this paper reported 111 accounts of quoll scavenging on a human corpse. Many of these cases were assumed from contemporary knowledge. So, for example, the shooting of Sergeant Kennedy by the infamous Ned Kelly gang. So sort of more like hearsay or urban myths, whereas others were reported in official reports. For example, there was one police report of 7 quolls feeding on a corpse. So for some reason, this research paper decided to look at the ratio of cases where quolls were feeding on men versus women, and also the area of the body that they like to consume the most. And they found that mostly it was men that were consumed, and consumption would occur within a few hours of death, with disfigurement of the face being the commonplace for quolls to go for, which probably has something to do with the fact that that is an exposed fleshy area on a clothed human. So on that lovely note, I will leave it there and just say thanks for tuning in. And today I have a link to a bit of a funny story about wombat poo if you're interested.